having finished grading your drafts, I think it'd be worthwhile to have a day that we sort of sit down and talk about sort of things about the paper. And what I wanted to do is go back over all of the comments I made to everybody and sort of pull out the big points that we should cover as a group. And one of the things I'd like to be able to do with that, and then also maybe talk about footnotes and that sort of junk, right? But one of the things I'd like to be able to do with that is sort of use some real examples. So what I'm going to do, unless you email me and say don't, is use sections from each of your papers to illustrate what we're going to talk about. I'm not going to put your name on it, and I'm willing to bet that I'm probably the only one who knows by memory exactly what each of you are doing, right? So if I were to use a section of Madison's paper, Madison would know and I would know, but I bet nobody else would know that that was from your paper, right? So if you don't want me to do that, and the whole point is to use this as a learning process. This is how we can move from here to here and be better. But if we do it in the abstract, it doesn't work as well. So if you don't want me to use your paper, just email me and say, please don't, and I won't, okay? So, but I think we'll do that on Friday, okay? And that way we can make some headway through. I don't think we'll finish Homer today, but we'll make some headway into Homer because there's a lot of sort of interesting things to discuss with Winslow Homer. Okay, so that'll be on Friday. So come prepared to sort of do some projects within class and really be talking about term papers, how to make them better, right? Also with your term papers, one of the things that you ought to do is, it's not mandatory, I don't think, but you come and talk to me about the paper. I'll be happy to sort of go through the draft bit by bit by bit and talk about how things can be better. And another thing that you ought to take advantage of is the writing center. Take your paper to the writing center and have, not that anybody's writing was bad, but that the writing center is not only for people whose writing is bad, right? It's there to help all of us become better writers. So if you do decide to use the writing center, and I'll say, by the way, that the group of papers as a group was one of the better groups I've had in a while. Like, there weren't any that were just like, oh my God, this is horribly written, which is usually the case. Anyway, suffice to say that if you want to take advantage of the writing center to improve, because everybody can improve, one of the things that you ought to do before you go over there is to be sure you bring a copy of the assignment so they know what you're trying to write, and don't just give them the paper, because otherwise they might tell you to do something that isn't what I'm asking you to do, right? So make sure you take the assignment with you. Okay? So take advantage of the things that Marymount makes available for you. Not only faculty having the doors open, but also the writing center. Okay? So again, Friday we'll sort of go over some of the nuts and bolts things. Back to Homer. As we talked about on Friday, and by the way, we finally got a week with no breaks, right? So our next 3 weeks of class, we're going to meet twice a week. I'm so used to having only one meeting a week that it's gotten weird. Homer began his career as an illustrator for Harper's Weekly. Right? He was making those drawings that he would transfer into wood engravings that would be printed in this weekly magazine, Harper's. And he was the staff artist for Harper's and had been dispatched by Harper's Weekly to cover the Civil War. And this experience covering the war led to his artistic career, really had a huge impact on his artistic career. As we see early on, of course, he begins to make paintings based on his experience being embedded. He went to the front twice. He was embedded with the troops. Right? We talked, he did KP duty, right? Washed and cooked and whatnot. And really experienced what life was like at the front and brought those experiences into his prints first, and then after that into paintings, and Home Sweet Home being one of his very first paintings derived from those experiences, and after the war, continuing to sort of capitalize on that experience. But there are other ways in which Homer's experience at the front ended up sort of influencing the rest of his career. And that is that he became a very, very close observer of the world around him and using those observations of the world around him as the basis for his images. So there are no historical scenes, right? Very, very few pure landscapes. There's some, right? But really, he focuses on human activity in the world around him, and makes that his principal subject matter, right? And so we looked at in the 1870s, he starts to do a series of images on rural farm life, right? Prior to that, he had done a number of images on harvests, but in the 1870s, he turns to other images of rural farm life. And again, it's that idea of moving from the comfort of his studio in New York out to some place where he's supposed to be observing, and then taking those observations and turning them into something that actually has a bit more meaning than just the recording of a day-to-day activity, right? He wants to give it a bit more heft. He wants to give it a bit more importance, if you will, right? And so our dinner horn, we talked about the sort of idea of the farmer's daughter as an object of male ogling, both on Homer's part, but maybe also on the farm hands, the upturned jug, but also the idea of adding narrative into things, right? As he becomes more involved with these images of rural life, he also turns to watercolor. And I was just reading something, I don't have it all memorized, about sort of the rise of watercolor, but there was some big shows of watercolor painting in New York, and it led to the establishment of the American Watercolor Society. And Homer was a member of this group, and we really see that from the 1870s on, watercolors become a major part of his creative process. And he doesn't see them just as sketches to be used for other works of art, although sometimes they function that way. But rather he sees them as independent works in their own right, just another paint medium to turn to. And so with each of these, he's using water-based pigments, but two different kinds. He's using transparent watercolors, but he's also using opaque gouache paint, right, to highlight some of this. So sometimes what we see is that some of the areas that are light, like the doorway behind or the roof above the sick chicken, are the white of the paper that's been allowed to come through, sometimes transparently, sometimes directly. And then other elements, like some of the hay on the right, it goes back over the top with a opaque paint, right? So he's really working with the medium. He's as skilled as anybody ever in the use of watercolors. I'm sort of just getting into them the first time for this class. I never really spent time with his watercolors before, but they're really something to aspire to, as are his observational skills. I think they're just extraordinary. So with all of these, he starts off with just a graphite sketch of the basic layout, and sometimes you can see the sketch lines underneath the paint, such as through the doorway with fresh eggs. And then he'll build it up, right, in layers of transparent watercolors that have this sort of translucence. If you look at the green shutter on the window, and how it's not just one part of green, but he's kind of built it up with layers and layers and layers of green, using it so that that transparency of the paper works its way through the different layers of color, and the color becomes that much more rich for it. And then I think because it was a lesser medium, it allows him a certain freedom he didn't have before, and the way he handles the roof line is sort of sketchy. And then we talked before about the spattered paint on the wall that seems to have been just taken a brush and shook it over the paper, and that helped to add to the sort of stucco effect of the wall off to your right in Sick Chicken, right? We were then talking about the degree to which the subject matter choices of farm life in the 1870s were very much based on what was going on as the most modern art movement in France at the time. The most avant-garde art movement, which is realism, which was only born in the late 1840s, right, as a response to the Third French Revolution of 1848, a response to some of the critiques of capitalism and industry that were coming out by Karl Marx, right, who said the Industrial Revolution was making machines of people who are working for other people's profit, and we've lost something of a connection, right, to the land. Millet, one of the most prominent of the realists in France, somebody who Winslow Homer is, I think, very much engaged with. He goes to France in 1866, spends a year there, 1866, 1867. Homer literally got a complete year in Paris, right? Studying. And if you know your way around French art at this time, it's kind of interesting who he's interested in, because it's interesting who he's interested in. Because by 1866, 1867, all the people who become the Impressionists are active, right? Pissarro, Monet, Degas, right? They're all active. But Homer seems, despite the fact that he has this broken Impressionist brushwork already in his art, very strongly, right? Going back. Look at how, even before he goes to France, how he's handling the wheat with these dapples of paint. Very much like the Impressionists already. How he knows is another question, right? But very much avant-garde. And in fact, Homer, all the way until about the mid-1880s, is criticized heavily for the sketchy quality of his paint. People like the subject matter, but they don't like the technique. They say it doesn't look finished, right? It's the exact same criticism that's being leveled at the Impressionists before they formed their group, okay? So Homer goes eventually now to Paris, 1866, 67, and all of the Impressionists are working, but he becomes enamored with Millet. That's the artist he seems to be responding to, because Millet's principal subject matter was farm work. And after coming back, this is where Homer turns his attention, is to life in rural America. Now, it's important to keep in mind that he's working out of New York City. He's marketing out of New York City, right? So not only the artist's studio, but all of the artist's patrons, all of his audience is urban. And these images of an idyllic countryside are really escapism, right? They're part of a broader idea of trying to get back in touch with a kind of life that the Industrial Revolution has rendered useless or alien to most people, right? And this kind of leads to a sort of difference between Homer's approach to realism and the French approach to realism. It was the tendency for artists, Millet, the other realists, Courbet, Rosa Bonheur, the entire group, to really focus on hard labor, really difficult work, people sweating and toiling, and often trying to enlighten their audience to the difficulties encountered by the rural working class, because they're Marxists, right? And they all were saying, you know, we people in the city are profiting from the hard labor of the people in the countryside, right? So there's this kind of socio-political agenda to French realism. Homer's much more idyllic. When people work in Homer's images, they don't really work. When people work, it seems as if it's a joy. You know, that it's not a struggle, it's not toiling. And I think that's really kind of the American approach to things, that good hard work is virtuous, right? Not a struggle. And so his images of rural life, even when people are busy working, never seem as if it's something that you wouldn't want to actually do yourself. Whereas oftentimes images from France give us the sense of what back-breaking, hopeless work this can be. Right? For all of the scale of Millet's Flax Breaker, there's still the sense that this is going to leave you bent at the end of the day. Right? And there's not that same sense with Homer. There's just sort of an ease to rural life. And that idea of approaching rural life as this idyllic environment, right? Where life is easy, is picked up with the romantic pictures that he does. And romantic, I mean quite literally romance, right? The images of courtship. And he does quite a few of these where the rural farmhand and the maid of the house are flirting it up in between their work. Right now, all of these references to hard work, his clothes, his suspenders, his pitchfork, her maid's outfit, all of these things suggest work that is being done or has been done or needs to be done. But at the same time, Homer focuses on periods between, right? There's no uh, master of the house yelling at them to get back to work, right? And again, these are all very much imagined images, right? But there's still uh, a sense that country life is wonderful, right? Charming, an antidote. And so when we look at his images of children, on a certain level, I think I left off class talking about the fact that maybe he's on one level suggesting that this is just part of human nature. When we're true to ourselves, this idea of courtship early on, the innocence of courtship amongst the kids, sort of versus a maybe more sophisticated hidden courtship from adults. But at the same time, these are images of, summers that never end, life when it's easy, life when it's simple. Uh, Again, graphite with transparent watercolor and often touches of gouache. You can see the places where he's working wet in wet, the bush in the lower right corner on the style on the left, or where he's working with dry brush where he drags it across, such as the highlights on that fence. Right? He's just a master at watercolor, and these allow him to develop these ideas. Right? Children only add to the idyllic nature of it, the sense of innocence. And there really is an amazing sense of place as well. With the hill cascading down, there is a sense that both of these we're talking about pretty much the same section of the same farm. And it is a farm we know he spent time on in the summer of '78, making a number of sketches that we would then convert both into watercolors and into finished paintings. And I think we left off with school time at the very end, which still seems to evoke almost this exact same landscape. Right? And again, it's this idea of country life as unspoiled by progress. Right? That's the theme he's working with. And it's a very romantic theme. I mean that by coming from romanticism, the idea that progress takes a back seat. But it's also, I think, in keeping with his interest in realist painting that he had seen on his trip to Paris. And he takes these sketches, and there's numerous things that appear in multiple pictures and sketches he made probably on site. And he again, as he composes the picture, he tries to give us, I think, some semblance of narrative, some quaint story, usually with some charm. Every now and then there's some danger that seems to creep in, especially later in his life. But at this point, the image is really intended, I think, to be this sort of charming evocation of the lost time, the single room. We still talk about the single room red schoolhouse, right? As a sort of the paragon of how education began in America. The little red schoolhouse. And Homer gives us exactly that. This is the one room schoolhouse where, regardless of age, everyone will school together, right? From the toddlers to the adults in a single classroom. And he gives us this group walking across the school, in front of the schoolyard, and suggests elusively, without tying it down, possible narratives. The placement near the door. Are they on their way to the first day of school? Right, the new family here with their nanny or their mother, bringing them to a sort of school filled with a bunch of little ruffians, right, in the background, the kid in the doorway, looking out, the little kid off to the right, or these figures behind, and the sense that they're keeping their distance gives you that added sense with the narrative that this is the first day of school, that these are the strangers to this new community, and have yet to be accepted into it, and maybe some fear with that, right, of what the first day of school is going to be like. Will they accept me? Or are they leaving? He doesn't make it clear, right? He just adds this sense that there's a narrative here, right? There's a story being told. One of his most famous of these images is in Youngstown, Ohio. There's actually a copy of it in the Met as well. Snap the Whip, where we have the exact same schoolhouse from the exact same point of view in the background. And we see children now playing during break time, playing the wonderful story, you know the game. You try and knock the kid at the end off of the whip, right? As the one at the front runs and makes quick turns, and you can see some of the kids spilling off as the whip has been cracked, and they can't keep their balance anymore. Homer's very, very good with children. He's just really terrific in painting images of children and capturing the joy and innocence of childhood. This particular image from 1872 was one of his most popular images. It was so popular, I said, that he did a second version of it, smaller than the original, hangs in the Met now. He was also asked by Harper's Weekly, the magazine he works for, to do an engraved copy of it for publication. And this only added to the popularity of that image, right? So it again shows Homer's interest in a simpler time, in a life unaffected by the worries of the city, where, in fact, children play and learn together. That said, children as a theme were not just this idea of the idyllic countryside as a respite from the city. That when we look at the theme of children in American art and literature of the late 19th century, one of the things we find is that they were a theme that was used with particular symbolic references in mind. And they shouldn't be all that surprising when you sort of find out what they are. It's like, well, duh, why didn't I think of that? Which is, on one hand, they become increasingly popular after the Civil War, after the end of the Civil War. And we read an article that talked about how, the harvest metaphor, farms became a sort of prominent metaphor after the war, and the idea of the blood, the soil soaked by the blood of the soldiers would now give fruit to the next crop, right? And now instead of harvesting bodies, we will now harvest the fruits that come from the peacetime, right? So on one hand, there's that, okay? But for children, there's also this idea that after the Civil War, children became a popular motif because on one hand, and this is the obvious part, they recall a simpler time, America's innocence, before that innocence was ruined by the war, where we fought against ourselves, right? Where the whole dream of America almost ended, right? The experiment with democracy, less than 100 years after we started, almost came to an end. So the idea of children evokes a simpler time when you were untroubled. So it's elegiac, right? It's nostalgic for an America that wasn't ravaged by internal strife, infighting. On the other hand, children after the Civil War became a look in the other direction, right? We can see children as a way of looking to the past, to an innocent time before the war, or children as a way of looking to the future, the next generation, the hope and dreams and future of this country are its children. And of course, children at school only drive that point home, don't they? Because they are now being educated to be the next leaders of our country, right? Some people even looked at Crack the Whip and said, Crack the Whip requires cooperation. You work together as a group. That also is a key theme after the Civil War. Reunification, coming back together for the common good. In this case, for the game to work. You need to work with each other. You need to hold hands. You need to try to hang on. That's the basis of the game. And for America, in the years immediately following the war, this is less than a decade, right? After the end of the war. This would be a very, very powerful metaphor for the future of this country. I just think these watercolors are fantastic. They're just so terrific. Young school teachers, so we've almost like we've gone inside the building at the blackboard, and it seems to be some sort of geometry lesson, right? At least that's what people thought, was that it's some sort of geometry lesson. Uh, but again, it's part of Homer's ongoing interest in sort of rural life, and particularly rural school life. But when we look at it more closely, and people who know the history of education and have studied sort of lesson plans and whatnot, say that they can't link what she's drawn on the blackboard to any known geometry lesson. Which seems odd because Homer is such a good observer. Why would he change what she's written on the board? And what they think is that it's not a geometry lesson at all, that it's a drawing lesson. We have a three-dimensional object directly behind her head. Right? We have finding the perfect center of a rectilinear composition. That is the basic, golden section, perfect size for a canvas or a drawing. That maybe indeed the entire image is an image of teaching art rather than teaching math. Homer signs it on the chalkboard as if he had picked up a piece of chalk and signed it. Right? His name is right there with all of these diagrams. That seems to suggest that there's a connection between what he's doing as an artist and what she's doing on the board. She's drawn his name for him. Right? Now, what's interesting about this is that drawing had actually become part of the elementary school curriculum in the 1870s for the first time. People recognized, as I hope people still do, people recognized that drawing was a crucial part of education. That when you drew, you learned observation skills that you don't learn in other classes. That when you draw, you learn communication skills that you don't get to hone in other classes. Right? It's a way of learning. It's a way of understanding by trying to transcribe the world around you. This was part of the curriculum for the first time now, at the moment that Homer is giving us these school scenes. That might be another of his major interests in rural images of children at school, is exactly this idea that drawing had become an important part of every American child's education as we move into the second century of American history. He's just great, right? They're just so wonderful. I could spend all day looking at Homer watercolors. And in fact, trying to copy them just to figure out how he did it. There's two boys waiting, looking for rocks in the inlet in the bay, probably agates and clams and whatnot, whatever they can find under the surface of the water, and how Homer's so good at capturing postures and poses and attitudes and a mood at the time. But then also, again, the sketchiness is so wonderful. The way in which the water has been built up to give you the sense of the gleam, the reflections, and the sunlight kicking off of it. And the more you look, the more you realize it's a combination of wet and dry paint, but applied in ways that we all could, if we're interested in making art, we all could learn from, because they're just so beautifully rendered this way. But at the same time, in that sketchy manner that got him in trouble, at least with the oil paints, with his critics. Living in New York, in 1873, Homer began to spend his summers, as a lot of people in New York did, at the beach, right? And he was originally from Massachusetts, and he ends up going back to Massachusetts to spend his summers. because it's hot, it's gross in the city. We all know that. You want to get away. You want to go someplace back, and I want to go back to Oregon in the summers. It's cooler there, right? It's greener there. Homer goes back to his home state of Massachusetts. He goes to Gloucester, which is right on the coast. It's sort of north of Boston, right? Gloucester Bay. And he spends the first of many summers there in 1873. And he makes a series of sketches. You see one on the left of the watercolors, which are, again, works of art unto themselves. They are complete works of art. But he also uses these sketches and manipulates them into completed pictures. Now, Dad's Coming on the right is a pretty small picture. The dimensions is like 9 by 14 inches, so it's not much bigger than your notebook, right? A smallish image. And in all of these, he's capturing, again, like he did with the schoolhouse pictures, the sense of what life was like at this time, right? How unspoiled and idyllic it was like to live in the countryside rather than the city, where you've got time to roll up your jeans and look for treasure beneath the surface of the water, where you don't have much to do but wait for Dad to get home from his fishing trip, right? The Dad's Coming picture is slightly odd in a way because there's something about it that's not quite right. We have a mother with her infant in arms, and we have a little boy, presumably hers, sitting on the prow of the boat as it's been jacked up on that log to get a better vantage point, to look for Dad's boat as he's coming home, waiting for Father. But there's a lack of interchange between any of the characters. Nobody's looking at each other. Nobody's communicating. The mother's not even watching the bay. It's looking out rather more toward us. And all of this provides a small amount of tension to the work. There's something just not right about it. That lack of dynamic between the characters who appear to belong to a single family just makes it slightly edgy. And this particular work, 1873, might actually relate to something that happened while Homer was in Gloucester. He spent the summer there. In August of 1873, there was a massive storm, and 128 men were killed. Right? Fishermen never came home. So, Dad's Coming, exclamation point no less, right? Could be the hopes and the dreams of the kid in the straw hat. And the mother's lack of regard at him may be that she really knows the danger. She understands that maybe Dad's not coming and is wrapped up in her own thoughts and doesn't want to yet tell the boy about this. Now, there's no sign of a storm in the picture, right? But there's a sense that the mother knows something's afoot. Dad's later than he should be. Okay? What Homer does in this, and this is something he does quite a bit, is he uses the frame of the picture to enhance the meaning. Our little guy, waiting for his father, stares off at something that he doesn't bother to show us. He's looking out of the frame of the picture, off to our left. And that adds to the sense of this little guy sort of looking to the horizon, looking to the vast beyond, and not fully understanding what it is at this point, right? Not fully getting what the world really means. And if, in fact, that historical detail is something that inspired Homer, that horrible storm, and all those men that were left dead in Gloucester, inspired the work, then our boy is looking out, hopefully to the future, and maybe also not realizing all the dangers that that future might hold, all the sadness and trauma that might be there. This summer in Gloucester in 1873 led to one of Homer's most famous and best received works. People actually really loved this, and they even said that it's so well composed that you can almost forget the sloppiness of his paint, right? They were almost willing to look past it. So when it was originally exhibited, it was called A Fair Wind. Then when it was reshown by a later owner in the 1890s, it was retitled Breezing Up, right? Breezing up is exactly what they're doing. They're pointing up toward the wind, right? They're tacking into the wind, and so the wind is coming off of the bow to sort of off their shoulders, and they're turning the boat into the wind, and it's catching the sail to drive them forward, thus breezing up, right? But the original title was much more idyllic, a fair wind, right? And fair meaning, of course, not just gentle, but favorable, right? A favorable wind. What he shows us is a boat in between work. It's a working fishing boat. They've already been at work. They have fish in the hold. You see quite a few of them there as we look more closely. But typical for Homer, an image of work puts him in the realist camp, labor, but people aren't really working. Right? It's the idyllic time between the different shifts, if you will, the different bouts of labor. Again, maybe this is nostalgic. This is the simple time when life doesn't demand much from you, the moments between the fishing moments. Work is never really hard. Right? He seems to focus with the kids on the relaxation at hand. Right? The one boy is helping to keep the sail full by pushing his feet outward on the knot that holds the sail to the rigging, and that keeps it from luffing, from losing the wind. The boy behind him couldn't be enjoying it more, and everybody's on the right side of the boat to keep it from keeling over, right? What do they call it? Hiking out or hauling out on the far side to balance out the boat. And we have the old man with three young boys, right? And that's, again, this important theme that Homer seems to be working with quite a bit, which is for America in the years after the Civil War, the idea of children as a theme that is the hope of America's future. Right? Now, he works this through a number of stages. He does watercolors that I think he originally intends as being sort of independent and complete works of art, but in this case also function as the inspiration for a finished oil painting. You'll notice a few differences. No boats in the background, for example. One more kid on the boat, in this case on the very front prow of the boat, right? Riding up front, enjoying it probably more than anyone else. But apart from that, mostly the same. He then works it through a very, very tiny picture, about like yay, that's also in the National Gallery, where the name of the boat is the Flirt, whereas he renames it Gloucester after where he painted it in the finished composition, and where again we still have the extra child on the boat. So as he works his way forward, he begins to change the details from his original conception, right? Figure out things he's going to work on. Now, he goes back to the New York studio with the sketches that he made in Gloucester over the summer, right? And some of the things he worked on. He's going to work this all up back in New York, okay? It takes him 3 years, and he writes in April of 1876 that I've been working on this for 3 years now, which is phenomenal to think about that, especially when we think about the criticism he always got for this loose brushwork that looks sketchy. When we see sketchy brushwork, we often think spontaneity, right? Quick, right? We think of the Impressionists. It's just a quick, fleeting impression because it's just sketchy. But that's totally a scam. It's an artifice. He wants you to think it's sketchy. He wants you to think it's spontaneous. But in fact, his sketchiness is the result of, in this case, 3 years of work. So he goes back to begin to make the larger picture after the Flirt, after the the watercolor, other studies as well. And he builds the picture. And we've gone back and looked at the large image, looked at Fairwind, under infrared, where we can see the layers of paint underneath. That's the same picture under infrared, right? With a camera trained to pick up the infrared wavelength, right? And you can see that when he started the picture, he actually had a lot of things that weren't there at the end. He still had the boy on the prow of the boat, the fourth boy, painted him out, right? He had more ships in the bay. One obvious behind the shoulders of the kid on the boat, another one between the two boys in the distance behind. Those are changed as well, right? Another important change that he made while working on it, like he began with this, I'm going to go back to Flirt for just a second. And this is really crucial. Those are just kind of compositional changes, right? They clarify the composition, get rid of the kid on the prow, and it becomes a sort of nicer flow. Get rid of that other boat in there, and it's better, right? Clearer outline of the figures. A more important change is that in Flirt, who's steering the boat? The old man, right? He's got his hand on the till. So he is guiding the direction of the boat. In Breezing Up, he started with that conception. The same conception is there in the watercolor. In Breezing Up, it's the boy on the helm that carries the till. It's the barefoot kid in the straw hat. And you can see that the arm of the till is moved as he's actually turning the boat to the right, as he's breezing up into the fair wind. This is symbolically incredibly important as a change. Because who was guiding now the direction? The children, right? Guide the direction of the boat. And if we think about the importance we've been talking about as children as the next generation, as the future, as what is leading our country into the next century. This change on Homer's part is a very conscious change of putting the till in the hands of the boy instead of the hands of the older man, suggests this idea that we, I'll say this now as a 50-something, need to give it over to you. Right? The future is yours, not mine. The direction of this country is yours, not mine. And what makes this such a wonderful picture, right, is not only does he do that, but he changes sort of the attitude of the man as he's steering. And if you look at him here, it's sort of like pulling hard, he's working both the sail and this, and the kids are just like he's taking them with him. Right? And he's the only one that's really doing any work here. Whereas in Breezing Up, he's still holding on to the sail, correcting the sail, right, trimming it. But the look on his face has changed. It's something that's confident. Right? This next generation, they know what they're doing. Right? For me, right, the message of this is stop bitching about the millennials. Everything's going to be good. Right? They are piloting our country now. Our work here is done. But right, that's part of Homer's message. It's the generation that got us through the first century should now give up the reins to the generation that takes to the second century. So the changes that he makes while working on the composition are important changes in the fact that they totally change the meaning of the work. Right? They don't just clean up the composition, but they alter some of the message that it gives. Now, if you keep in mind what he said, that I've been working on this thing for 3 years now, he finally displays it in 1876 for the first time in public, in early summer 1876. And if we keep in mind that he's been working on it for 3 years, then we look back at the surface of the picture. We realize the degree to which, despite all of that work, the one thing Homer never changes is the sketchy quality of it. He's been working on it for 3 years, but he's not working to blend brushstrokes, to polish the surface. He wants to leave it looking spontaneous, even though it was not spontaneously created. And that's something that we see in all sketchy-looking art, at least in the 19th century. Monet's works, for example, look sketchy, but they're not. They're built over surfaces on surfaces on surfaces. They're the result of long hours of work, but he preserves the idea of spontaneity. For Homer, right, I think this is kind of important. It goes back to what we started class with. What kick-started Homer's career? Observing and reporting, being an eyewitness. I was here. I saw this. And I'm now going to show you what I saw. That sense of being the witness to a moment in time is something that Homer's trying to get across with all of his pictures. He is a witness to a particular moment. And even if it takes him 3 years to get there, he wants the work of art to seem as if it's a particular moment. And the spontaneity of how he paints is a key element in that. And everywhere we look, it looks as if it's just sketched. The trail of water coming off the rudder, off to the right of my detail here. Amazing sort of sketchiness after 3 years of work, right? Submits it finally to the National Academy of Design in early summer 1876. This is kind of an important part of these changes that he'd made because 1876 is, of course, an important year for us in America. It's 100th anniversary of the Revolution. It is our centenary. And in fact, the country's planning a major World's Fair in Philadelphia at that time, in 1876. Right? So the moment when he is, the year in which he's finally completing the work and displaying it is a work that shows the previous generation giving things over to the new. Right? That's a theme that was on everybody's mind in 1876. One last detail that I really like. One of the last things, he puts this wonderful little red flag right on top of all the paint in the back. And it's not in any of the studies or anything. And it's just this sort of punchy little red element there. And you can see it's almost like he got done. I don't know, we can't trace this for sure. It's almost like he finished the painting and said, you know what? It needs this. And he gives us that little hook back there as one of the sort of the last things he does, a little sketchy flip of that hook. This detail shows us something else that's, I think, important and reflects the working process. Is you'll notice that the brush strokes through the sails don't follow the sails. Does that make sense? Right? So these brush strokes that start over here, look at this stroke of paint here. See that ridge? Or this one down here? You see that? Can you tell what's going on there? He's painted something else underneath. And the paint's dried. And then he's come and painted the other stuff over the top of it. Right? But he's left those ridges there. And he's going to try to cover those up. Does that make sense? He's leaving the traces of all of the steps that led to the final surface of the picture. And it only indicates to us that that sketchiness that we appreciate in Homer's work is in fact totally an artifice. Right? Layer upon layer upon layer of paint, and sometimes the lower layers are there and left only as texture. Right? That the top layer of paint grabs on a little bit. So the sketchiness that we see in Homer is really artificial, right? It has nothing to do with the actual work of art. 1876, he submits this to the National Academy of Design in the early part of the summer. Later in the summer, there's the World's Fair in Philadelphia called the Centennial Exhibition, mounted in Philadelphia, PA. This is where the Gross Clinic by Thomas Eakins that we had the reading on, that was in this same exhibition, right? So this was to celebrate 100 years of American progress. Right? That was the whole point of the World's Fair. Here we are on our 100th birthday. What have we achieved? Right? What's great about America? And I think for Homer, what's next? Right? Akins gives the Gross Clinic as a sign of American medical progress. And as we read, it's rejected because it's too gory, right? They end up putting it in a medical display of a medical instrument, not with the rest of the art. Yeah. Homer takes Snap the Whip, one of his most famous earlier works, and submits it, is accepted to the Centennial Exhibition. So the idea that children are the future is certainly on Homer's mind. Otherwise, he would not have submitted. If the theme of the exhibition is American progress and American future, why does he send them all of his paintings to this one? Because that's his theme, right? What's great about America? Our relationship to the land, right? How we brought ourselves up from nothing. How this country, which started as wilderness, has become something civilized. And how children are working together to build a better future. Right? These must be on his mind. Otherwise, he would not have submitted it to that exhibition. And they certainly are on his mind with Breezing Up, which was displayed only about a month or two before the Centennial Exhibition, where he is now given the till of the boat over to the child. So children play a large role in Homer's work, not only as idyllic images of a non-industrialized, idealized world, but also as metaphors for country, right? Metaphors for progress in the future. The sea becomes a major part of Homer's output after he begins to summer in Gloucester. Eventually, he will move to Maine and spend the rest of his life there. 1883, he moves to Maine. And from that point forward, sort of the wilderness of Maine and the oceans around the Maine coast become a huge part of his output. And his fishing pictures, his water pictures, remain some of his most beloved and best known works. Again, he's often focusing on sort of the mundane activities around the seaside. Fishermen's wives with their children walking the beaches, perhaps scavenging. Also, the girl carrying a basket, very much the same, looking for treasures that might have washed up along the beach. They're all just very charming and idyllic, and they make you want to be those people. They make you want to participate in these activities that don't have a clock, that aren't surrounded by buildings, where the air is better, life is more pleasant. Sometimes they get dangerous, sometimes they get scary, simply entitled Danger. Painted the summer he moved to Prout's Neck in Maine, which is where he spends the rest of his life. Two girls now walking along the beach, similar to the others, but in some risk. Nature itself having the possibility of sweeping them away at some point. Homer capturing all of these ideas. This one's quite mysterious. Into the 1890s, another woman walking on the side of the beach carrying the nets that she's gathered with a very strange posture. And again, in a very Winslow Homer element, looking off frame, looking to something that we don't see. She's been startled, perhaps, or at least something's caught her notice. But we don't know exactly what it is. Something else is happening here. Some have suggested that the seagull in the background also may be responding to some sort of unseen sound, right? Our seagull up above. which also seems to be painted at the very, very end of the composition, just quickly on top of the other paint. But the mystery of this woman sort of added by the reflection on the sea of the sun, which we also don't see, having broken through the clouds over her head somewhere, and the direct source of light, which is the reflection of the sun off of the ocean, is guarded and masked, silhouetted by her body as she looks over at something that we don't get to see. The danger of the Maine coast is something that he often focuses on while living in Maine. He lives there really entirely for the rest of his life, all the way till 1909 when he dies. And in this case, we're looking down over the breakers in a somewhat precarious position. And something that you might miss at first, and something that drives home the idea of how treacherous this is there's a group of figures standing in the upper right corner. 3 people walking out to take in the view. And you can see that the waves are breaking up the rocks and moving right directly toward them. Right? So Homer's really very much taken with the ocean, with the sea. And many of his best beloved pictures are images of life in and around the sea, sometimes idyllic and sometimes treacherous. His technique remains sketchy, remains unresolved. It's almost as if he's having a love affair with the paint itself. Here, a detail of the foam, and as we dive in more closely, you can see that he's, again, especially in this section here, he's built up a ridged area underneath with paint, and then come back over the top of it and allow the brush to drag across those ridges that he's built up in order to give us the effect of the foam and of steam that rises from the wave. And there's even places where he builds up an impasto, thickness of the paint, with the idea that he's almost trying to turn the paint into the sea foam, and trying to capture not only what it looks like, but what it is, right? Its true three-dimensional quality. I always like details like this because I was a failed painter. I sucked at painting, like really badly. I could draw fine, I just could not paint to save my life. And the reason I think I couldn't paint is I had this idea that you always had to paint the things in the back first and paint the things that were closest to you last, right? So that the three-dimensional quality of the surface of your picture would look like the three-dimensional quality you would see. That's why I approached it, right? But the more I look at paintings by, especially 19th century artists, but really everybody, you realize that's not how they paint. Always. And like if I were stuck painting this, I'd be trying to paint the water between the rocks first and then paint the rocks because they grow, they're in front of that. But if you look at how Homer's painted here, you can see that he's actually brought the water up onto it, almost as if the paint is the water itself. And so in these 2 inlets here and here, you can see that the paint's the last thing to go down. Right? He's bringing the paint up into the area here, as if it were actually the wave and the water itself moving across the rocks. That there's a back and forth between where the paint or how the paint is laid down. That is a great lesson, right? Those of you who are art, a lot of you in here do art. Spend more time at the museum, right? Because there's lessons to learn there, even if you're not interested in 19th century art because of its subject matter. There are things that really would make us better painters in the long run by sticking our nose into these things and spending time with them. Look at that, right? The amazing lichen on the rocks. And again, at this point, when I get close enough, this could be a painting from the 1950s. You know, this could be an abstract work by someone like Dubuffet or something like that, because he's not at all interested in blending what he's laid down. He's interested in the effects of the paint and how they sort of evoke the ideas of rocks. By the 1890s, this sketchy approach, which is what American critics called it, had become a little bit more tolerated. Right? Art had become, we'd gotten past the Impressionists by this point by a good 20 years. People had become accustomed to seeing this. And Homer's works became better accepted because of that. But they still, I think, remain brave and bold and incredible insofar as the degree to which he's pushing the normal application of the medium. I have one last detail, and I have no explanation for this. He signed it twice. Once lightly, and then there's a piece of paper that's been cut out and laid down, and he signed on top of that. And I looked everywhere to figure, the Smithsonian stuff didn't say anything about it, right? I can't figure out why. If I were going to write a term paper, I'd be fine to figure out if that's something that's unique to this, right? What I was able to find was that somebody has another Homer with a fake signature on it, they think, although he's absolutely sure it's legitimate. But what's up with this little collage down here? Is he covering up a hole in the canvas with this? I don't have any idea. It's got to be published somewhere. I simply couldn't come across it. What's cool, though, I think those are thumbprints. You see that around the bottom part of the here? I think those are fingerprints in the paint around that piece of paper that he's applied to the right corner. Well, he didn't spend all of his time at the coast. Remember, he's living in Maine from this point forward. He's abandoned New York City. He'll still show there, but he's working now in and around Maine. He'll make various trips into other states and, of course, inland as well. And he was an avid fisherman. Really kind of an avid outdoorsman, but particularly good and engaged with fishing. And does a number of watercolors to evoke the experience. Whenever he would go out fishing, whenever he'd go out backpacking or hiking, he always took a sketchbook. He just never went anywhere without a sketchbook. And those sketches then became the stuff of his different images that he'd work up in watercolor and eventually in paint as well. And he seems to be particularly insightful and sensitive to the rhythms of fishing, the different kinds of fishing. So our lone fisherman on the right is simply troll fishing, right? He's drifting through the water with the line out. Fly fisherman on the left, dry fly fisherman, with the line going off. And do you know this? Fly fishing, right? You lay the line out. The line will float on top of the water, and the last 6 foot length of it is clear. So the fly sits on the top of the water at the end of that, and the fish thinks that it's just a bug that's landed. It's got a hook in it, right? That's how they get nailed, right? Whereas the lone fisherman on the right is catching fish underwater rather than on the surface. Okay, and in each of these, Homer suggests that he knows what's going on with the image, and you can see my dad was a fly fisherman, right? He had a couple of fly fisherman awards, and I inherited all of his poles. I've been thinking about putting it in my office, but there's the line, and that's exactly how it lays out, right? And the way he's doing this is he's scratching back through the surface of the paint, right? This is watercolor on paper. So what he's done is he's come back through with a blade, something sharp, to reveal the paper underneath again, to give you that glow that comes off of the line. And these are phenomenal. And then down below around the rod, I just love the way the greens and the blues work together, and how things that might be mistakes, like this place where the blue and the green paint have met wet on wet, they just work, right? It just turned into something that evokes the way in which that hill is reflecting off of the water. I can't say enough good about Winslow Homer. I just think he's a fantastic painter. Look at the reflections in the foreground of casting number 2, where you see the red of his hands being picked up with 2 little spots in the water down below, suggesting that all of that is meant to be seen the reflection of him, right? How oftentimes the reflections will show us things that we can't see otherwise in the picture. Here, right, the rise, he's looking for the fish rising. That's what the title refers to. as he's working his way out into the water. Has he stopped rowing? And I don't know the history of motorboats, right? This has got to be 1900 maybe, but maybe he's just hung up his oars and is now drifting and waiting for the fish to rise as he's out in the wilderness. He loves, you'll notice, the sense of what it would be like to be a fisherman out here, in that with all of their gear, you'll notice he emphasizes how red their skin gets from sitting out in the sun all day, right? Let's see what's coming up next. He was not so much an avid hunter, although he did quite a few hunting pictures as well. And this is probably the last thing we look at today. Moving into the Adirondack Mountains, moving from his home in Crouch Neck, Maine, he would accompany hunters as an outdoorsman, just go along for the ride, if you will. And did a number of these images that evoke sort of life on the hunt. At the same time, they can't necessarily be an observation because of where he puts us. There's no way he could have seen this happen in the way that he illustrates it here. So a good shot in the Adirondacks, right? He's suggesting that this is something he saw, some crack shot got off a good shot, killed the deer, right? And he's taking probably something that he saw. He probably saw that deer, maybe dead. There's something about the way it's posed right now that suggests that it might have been tied to something at some point in the carcass. And it's come across the river, and it's still splashing, and it's trying to get away. Because our huntsman is out here with his dogs, right? And you see the dogs in the background, right? And they chase the deer into the open, okay? And the deer's trying to get away from the dogs, and the best way to get away from dogs, you've seen this in every prison escape movie you've ever seen, is you go to the water, right? Because they lose the scent. And we humans do that because animals do it. We figured it out. And so the deer has just about made it, right? It's escaped the hounds, right? They're not going to catch it, and it's made it across the river, and it's leaping onto the far side, and we can see the water bubbling on. And look at that. The water on the left of the deer is just spectacular. That blue that runs through, right? And just at the moment when the deer is about to get away, boom, right? All we see from the hunter, a little darkness back here, and the gun, right? So the deer is caught at the exact moment it's been shot, right? A good shot in the Adirondacks. He's on the side of the hunter, right? This is not about the poor deer. Maybe it is, but the title suggests that it's showing us a champion marksman hitting a running deer, running away from it across, a rippling stream, right? Now, at the same time that the title, and look at this, right down to the day and date, October 12th, 1888, documentary, right? Go back to the early part of his career, right? He's a documentarian. That's what his job was when he started. Right? The deer is beautifully drawn. My goodness, right? And again, starts with graphite, works over the top of it with watercolor, and then comes into the top of that with gouache. But there's something about this picture that is, even though the title suggests that it's a champion hunter, that the theme is a champion hunter, if you think about where we are, where he puts you as a viewer, your view is the view of the deer, that the deer has. Who do you share with in this picture? You share with the deer, right? The deer doesn't see the hunter back there. We don't see the hunter back there. The deer hears the sound. We see the smoke, right? We're caught at the moment of the deer's death, and we share the space with the deer. Now, I don't know anything about Homer's attitude toward hunting and conservation and whatnot, but there's something about this picture that makes me want to be a vegetarian. There's something about this picture that says, and my wife and I watch a lot of cooking shows. Most chefs will tell you, if you eat meat, you should go cut something up. And understand what it's all about. Just not that it's cruel or anything, but you should know. Meat doesn't come in plastic styrofoam packages. Right? Meat comes on the hoof. There's an empathy here and an amazing sort of drama that comes with this picture. Even though this is a little watercolor, right? Like that. That he's captured the moment of death. And the eyes of the deer, which becomes sort of the thing once you see them, you can't get rid of these, are at the moment when it sees death. Right? It knows it's over. Right? And he puts us there. Obviously, this has to be made up, right? He's not a remote photograph. There's no way he's watching you shooting this direction from here. Right? This is not happening. Because nobody would be shooting if they saw him. Right? But he plants us here so that we understand this. Right? And this is not the only place where Homer does that with his paintings. Not the only place where Homer gives us a hunting scene where our empathy ends up with the thing that's been killed. Right? And I don't know how to explain this entirely. Right? Because so many of his works are about this sort of these images of men in the countryside doing manly things like fishing in the country. You know, and controlling the country, right? In a way. They're taking control of nature. They're dominating, right? They're leaders of men out there. There's something about them that has that quality. But there's something about some of these that have this incredible sadness and empathy with the animal, right? He understands that right? So, anyway, I think that's a good place to stop. The next one will take up a bit more time, and we only have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So on Friday, we'll talk about term paper nuts and bolts. Finish up Homer, move on to Thomas Eakins, right? From there, I think through the last 2, because we have 2 more weeks after this one, is that right? The last 2 weeks we'll be getting into Impressionism in America, particularly John Singer Sargent, but others as well, the last 2 decades of the century. So look, we almost made 1900 already. We could quit now. Okay, so I'll see you guys then, and I'll be working, I think, this afternoon and tomorrow morning on your last response paper, right, which I still have to get back to you.